Just pause the recording. There's a pause up in the top
What
left.
does that look like?
Oh.
Great. So welcome back to the Or Zarua Beit Midrash, whether you're here in person or in the extension of the Beit Midrash on Zoom. Tonight's seminar is going to be Jewish law seminar about abortion and Jewish law, take 2, modern responsa and current thinking, after we just do a little bit of a review when it comes to some vocabulary and sources that we want to remember. So I'm indebted to the Rav Beit Midrash of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, with whom I got to learn these sources back a while ago. And Rabbi Dov Linzer is really an expert in these sources about abortion. And I've chosen a number of them and picked them in an order for the source sheet I'll share on the screen in just a little while, after I remind us of some very important vocabulary in regards to the whole topic of abortion. One is, we saw that an ubar, a fetus, is a yerech imo. That is, it's a limb of the mother. This is written in Gemara Eruvin, and it's something we need to keep in mind, that it's part of a woman's body, the fetus, and in being part of a woman's body, it doesn't exist independently. This is a direction that I might use if I was a halachic decisor, if I was a posek. I might be able to rely on any one of these topical kind of frameworks that I'm supposing now, based on the fact that they exist in the Gemara. And when I am thinking about halachic decisions, a lot of times I can rely on what's written in Gemara, and even if it's breaking with a whole line of thinking that reinterpreted that area of thinking, I might come back to it and argue that that is the operative principle by which we should be making our decision at this point in history, or given a certain case, if someone presents a case to me. The next phrase that I want to remind you of is ritzicha. That is murder, killing. And we talked about whether or not abortion could be categorized or should be categorized as a capital crime. And if it's a capital crime, I have a whole different kind of respect for this action I'm about to take vis-a-vis a fetus within the womb of a mother. If this is ritzicha, retzach, if it's murder, then I have to be very careful regarding the fetus side that could be legislated, could be codified within the criminal code, and I have to make very significant decisions as to whether or not it fits into the same category as killing another person or human being, and I have to start thinking about whether or not I kill them wantonly with some mens rea, meaning that I've done a first-degree homicide, or it's like the manslaughterer. I might have to talk about what it means in terms of my penal code and the punishments that are available. Does someone actually get capital punishment for it? What kind of capital punishment do they receive? But we remember the source we read together in Exodus that said if 2 men are fighting and they accidentally cause a miscarriage, then the individual is fined. From that, I saw that the whole inyan, the whole topic, is really a topic within tort law and not within capital criminal code. And being that I'm in tort law and that there's a fine for the miscarriage, and I saw sources within the Mishnah up until the very last moment before the baby's born that says and uses terminology that even though it's chai, and we pointed out the word chai is life and that it was used for the life of the fetus and the life of the mother, we said that word life was really about more potential life of the fetus. The true life of the mother took precedence. There wasn't the word nefesh used for the actual fetus or the formed near baby that was about to be born, if it had not been born, I did not penalize the individual for, given the graphic nature. I always again remind that these texts are very straightforward. We needed to take the baby out piece by piece in order to save the life of the mother. We did it. Idea came, I mentioned this idea, we will see it inside today, in the Tosafot. Maybe because the Rambam started talking about the baby being a rodef, the one that's pursuing the mother to kill her, maybe what the Rambam, what Maimonides really meant, was that I should start to see this fetus and this formed baby, especially in late term, as a real life form, as a person with rights. Because why else use the framework of another capital criminal law, capital kind of matter of law, that is self-defense or killing an individual who is pursuing another to cause them bodily harm? Why should I use the category of rodef that I know from Masechet Sanhedrin, from the tractate about laws that protect me if I kill someone because they are pursuing another to kill them? Why should I use those laws to describe a fetus unless the fetus is himself, herself, an actual life form, person, has rights under the law? The majority of people who understood that Maimonides used this category loosely seem to go the way of the Mishnah's spirit in Mishnah Ohalot that we learned. And that is, he's just telling you a framework to think about it. The fetus itself is like a rodef. It's like the one pursuing another to cause them harm and even kill them. And in that vein and in that light, for that reason, I can take the fetus out of the mother's womb piece by piece if I have to. But I am not applying the category per se of rodef when I use it as an example to have you understand the spirit of our approach to abortions and to the fetus and its status in our world. Now, I want to mention again that this has been somewhat of a very difficult reality for fundamentalists who don't want to hear that Jewish interpretation would allow for a read of the sources that say, up until the last moment, we really do dismember this fetus in order to save the life of a mother. That's not just, though, against a fundamentalist approach. That's very difficult for folks who are even approaching this from the life is sacred and abortion can't just be performed wantonly, wildly, at will. But poskim, halachic decisors, have indeed, in the end of a pregnancy, in the end, not at the end, where there's birth, but in the very moments of the end of a pregnancy, they have needed to deal with these questions from Jewish families, from women, from the men and women who bring them these questions, from the couples who come with these questions, and they have had to make these hard decisions. Now, I'm going to go back through a few sources on our source sheet this evening that allow us to just get our heads back around even what I've just taught with a little bit of an expansion. Because the Tosafot, as I had mentioned, want to push the direction that, in fact, this whole enterprise should be forbidden. Abortion is about killing a nefesh. Because why else would I be able to perform an abortion on a Shabbat unless I was talking about pikuach nefesh, saving an actual life? How do we know we're allowed to save an actual life on Shabbat? There's a passage in a text that says, I'm allowed to bring that unique and special surgical knife that we use for this through the public domain to perform this on a woman who unfortunately died on the Sabbath. And if I'm allowed to carry in the public domain, say the Tosafot, who are looking at things very, very particularly through a halachic lens all the time, and learning from what we allow in terms of very detailed, itemized particulars about the halakhot in regards to the knife that someone carries to perform either a bris, the moil's allowed to carry the knife, or someone coming to perform an abortion, the knife that they carry into the home from the public domain, which otherwise would be disallowed because it's the public domain and I don't allow carrying. Forget the fact you could have an Eruv and carry. For people who don't know what I'm talking about in terms of the Eruv and carrying on Shabbat, just a reminder that we don't allow carrying through public domains. And in order to have an abortion from a mother's womb who is in the process of dying or has died, we allow that carrying to happen. And we bring that knife into the house and we find the person who actually can do this in the safest way possible. So if I can allow that abortion to happen on a Shabbos and the carrying happened as well, doesn't that argue for the fact that this fetus is indeed a nefesh? Because the only category that would allow me to allow that to happen on Shabbat is pikuach nefesh, is saving a life, is saving a person. But most other people reject what the Tosafot say. So not to worry, not everybody agrees, practically no one, that it's really a nefesh. And the status of a fetus is seen as very different within halachic literature, even during the Middle Ages when the Tosafot are writing, and in through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, which we're going to get to tonight. Okay, sharing the screen. I need to go find and put in front and center behind you on my screen the right source sheet. Oh, and I got it full screen. Thank you, Helene, for the technical help again tonight. And now I'm going to share the screen, which will be, I hope, full screen, and you'll see it. All right. I see Sharon Ashley and David Silver. Can you see the source sheet on the screen with a thumbs up? Would you nod or give me a thumbs up? Great, thank you. So I want to take you first again to Masechet Nida that says pretty clearly what we have established already with some other sources. V'hahorgo chayav. The one who kills a one-day-old baby is liable for his murder. So if you thought we were talking about infanticide is possible within 30 days, because we don't call them fully human, or within 8 days, because we don't call them fully human. And I'm just steering into some principles that I didn't teach you exist on the books, but I'm just mentioning them, and you go with me here. Yeah. There is some thinking along these lines, especially if you have a premature birth. And they thought the baby was going to be too weak. They started to debate, should we actually take the life of this infant? And in the ancient world, you could understand why. They didn't have neonatal units. They didn't have great ways to keep those babies alive. So the Mishnah teaches, and one who kills a one-day-old baby is liable for his murder. So that's beyond his head came out and you don't touch him. That's a one-day-old baby, but now you're really liable for murder. The Gemara explains that the reason for this is, as it's written, he who smites any man mortally shall be put to death. Ki yake kol nefesh. There's our word nefesh. Now that's the Gemara in Nida, and this is the Tosafot that I told you about. Im tim silomar demutar lahorgo bebeten afilu meita imo v'lo have kemunach kufsa v'amay mechalin alavet hashabis. Were you to ask if it's permissible to kill a fetus in the mother's womb, even after the mother has died, ... why can we violate Shabbos for him? Unless he was a nefesh, in other words, unless you define this as pikuach nefesh, and that the fetus has status, I can't understand why you would not just allow the fetus to die with the mother. And if you're going to opine that, like Eruvin says, that the baby is simply a part of the mother's body, I might have the halachic obligation to allow the fetus to die with the mother. But Judaism doesn't necessarily have to go with the one or another category absolutely applied. What we do sometimes, the Tosafot are not doing here, that is, we learn broadly from one category to inform our approach in very distinct and unique situations, especially when life is at stake. Like the Rambam was learning from Rodef to kind of explain to you why we would take the baby from the mother's womb until the head really saw the light of day. Over here, we're saying that there's potential life. I reminded you of Mishnah Ohalot, and I remind you that they do indeed, all the way to the end, say that the mother's life comes before the life of the child. That's not the whole ethic, though, of abortion, that the woman makes any possible decision within the framework of our tradition, because the woman makes any possible decision, but she goes and she consults with halachic decisors, with people who understand Jewish law, and with people who are informed about what it is we are discussing when it comes to the fetus and what it represents. Some will turn to this source of the Ramban, who's writing about the very human realities we may face as a people. The Mishnah in Ohalot states, if a woman is in hard travail, one cuts up the child in her womb and brings it forth member by member, because her life comes before that of the child. But if the greater part had proceeded forth, meaning the head came out, or the majority of its body, depending on which manuscript we said last week, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. Now this implies that beforehand, before the birth, there is no concept of saving a life. Similarly, the Mishnah states in Nida that if a person murders a one-day-old child, he's liable the death penalty. We just saw that. That's the Nida passage that I showed you above. That is, only a one-day child, not a fetus. And the verse also states that one pays monetary compensation for causing a miscarriage. That was the Exodus source that we learned last week. Nevertheless, regarding the issue of mitzvah observance, we violate Shabbat for a fetus. The Torah says, violate one Shabbat for him, for perhaps he might keep many Shabbats. Therefore, even to save a fetus less than 40 days old, which has no current viability, we would desecrate Shabbat according to Hilchot Gedolot. Now, wait a minute. It's not just about abortion that we are talking now. Now we understand the true aspect of this bringing the knife in. It's basically their version of a C-section. We want to save the potential life, but we don't want to even have that defined necessarily, that a fetus who might endanger a mother turns into a full nefesh. The Ramban was careful here to use halachic language that does not categorize the pikuach nefesh aspect, neither of the fetus nor of the mother, when it comes to either aborting a pregnancy or saving a potential life which is the fetus, the near full term or the all the way full term fetus. The Ramban is very careful so that Mishnah Ohalot becomes the functional ruling about abortion, even late term, and our approach to the fetus as an entity within the womb of a mother is not then taken over by tosafistic approaches in halacha, which for the history of halacha is very important, because everybody could have just gone with the notion that, maybe we should talk about this from a pikuach nefesh standpoint. Either of the fetus or of the mother. That doesn't take hold, and we're really dealing with this approach, this basic approach from Rashi. And Rashi was on Sanhedrin, and I had mentioned this last week. I think we saw it inside, but I wanted to bring it again. Dechol zaman shelo yatzal la'avir ha'olam. From the moment that the baby's formed until the time that it actually sees the light of day, love nefeshu. It's not what we call a nefesh. Therefore, you don't define it as a person, and capital crimes are not how we approach what goes on with the fetus. Rashi to Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides codifies whether a man killed an adult or an infant of one day, male or female, he must be executed. If he committed deliberate murder, or exiled if he killed unwittingly. But that's not the case, and he doesn't codify it for either abortion or even what is killing unwittingly during this attempt to save the fetus if the mother's dying on Shabbat. He doesn't codify that as murder in either case. So I think that's what we need. Just to show you, the Shulchan Aruch actually decides the same way. So a lot of times in halachic history, and I don't want to go too deeply into all of these, but I wanted to throw some of this in because we're going through sources that are really centuries over the centuries. And Rambam's writing in the 1100s, the Shulchan Aruch, of which this is a part. This is Choshen Mishpat in front of you on the screen. This is a 16th century law code by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And we have a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch by Moshe Isserles, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who lives in Krakow. So we have the Ashkenazic meets the Sephardic, and we have a big law code that becomes the seminal law code for the Jewish people. And even Rabbi Isaac Klein, who wrote the conservative book on Jewish practices in the home and Jewish practices in general about our lives, so much of it is based on the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch here actually brings the example of the Mishnah in Olo using Rambam language and codifies it into the 16th century. And so it's seeming as though we have a baseline that the mother's life takes precedence. We never get to a place where the fetus is defined as a nefesh and we have to decide between the nefesh inside the womb versus the mother. And there's still some nuanced approaches regarding who should perform the abortions and when we allow for them and which period of time, which we saw last time. They were debating about the first 30 days, 40 days, the next several months, when the baby starts kicking. We didn't look at sources like that, but those kinds of questions had come up for the sages, and that's where we land 16th century. Now in 16th and 17th century, we're going to get into a whole different question, but I think at this point, I'm going to stop to share just for a second, and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions or desire for clarifying questions or comment thus far, because we went back through and saw a deepening of what we kind of learned last week in order to get us to all the material someone might have on his shelf if he's a halachic response, a halachic decisor. Okay, Diane, saw a hand.
So I was interested in one of the passages you went through quickly, that a baby that is premature it kind of is not a nefesh until 30 days after birth.
I actually mentioned that outside. I don't have the source on the sheet. And if we were doing a shiur about halacha, about prematurely born babies, I would bring you through some of that thinking. But in the short form, yeah, you heard correctly. They had debates about what to do if they had early births, if they had premature babies. And they would, give many a chance and do everything they possibly could. But there was some debate about whether or not living for 8 days or 30 days was considered the mark of viability, and whether or not someone would be penalized if they were the one to do it. Because remember, that question of would you be penalized if you're the one to do it, in the same spirit that the debate raged about whether or not Jews could perform the abortions or non-Jews should perform the abortions, and what it meant to legislate such things, meaning would you encourage it if you said it was non-Jews, or would you encourage it if you said it's Jews, or would Jews take it and understand the ethic of, sanctity of life more, and that's why we see in Sanhedrin that Jews should do it. Anyway, all these questions come into play, and so it moves from feticide to infanticide somewhere in the spectrum analysis, and those are very, very humane discussions in the sense of trying to figure out just how we work this through within our criminal code and for families who have to understand these choices.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, let's move on because we're now into some pre-modern and modern times here. I think you'll find these interesting and wonderfully exploratory, and sometimes we do get lost in the weeds of halachic discourse, but I'll try to bring it back around, and I've tried to pick out the essence of what sometimes are longer tshuvot, longer responsa literature that really bring us into the varied cases that came before real rabbis and families over time. From looking at these, we'll be able to, I think, further describe that greater ethic, the framework of our approach, a potential approach that we each might take from within a sense of our Jewish sources, inform our way forward in our thinking about terminating pregnancies, abortion, and the like. All right, so you see that I'm on source 9 for those here, and first of all, just a word about the kind of sources we're looking at. When we do Talmud class, we kind of stop sometimes and also do technical terms. So I just want to mention that this Shin Vav Tav is, we just say shoot. And I don't mean like shoot. I mean Sheila Utshuva. So shoot literature is halachic responsa literature because there are questions and answers. And in this case, it's the shoot of the Maharit, who's a sage. The Maharit I have mentioned here is Rabbi Joseph ben Moses Trani, son of the Mabit, who was born in Sfat in 1568 and died in Constantinople in 1639. And we're going to see in his Sheila Tshuva, in his responsum, from Chelik Aleph, part 1, section 97. These are quite long sometimes. Sometimes they're very short. So it just depends on how much time on a Shabbos afternoon you have before you fall asleep for your nap. So, Tshuvot Ma'arid, I'm going to read it outside the Hebrew. Question. Regarding a fetus which is considered the thigh, like the one asking the question knows a little Gemara. Wait a minute, let's unpack that for a second. So I'm coming at this from the fact that I think the questioner says that a fetus is just like the limb of a woman. It's a part of a woman's body. So, regarding a fetus which is considered the thigh of its mother, in the second chapter of Chulin, Tosafot wrote that while one is exempt from killing a fetus, it is nevertheless not permitted to do so. The reason is that it's forbidden on the basis now of bodily injury. Oh, so if they couldn't say it's a nefesh and that you're going to totally kill a nefesh, now they're going to go back and say in their community, one of the Tosafists, because you could say, again, halachic history here, you could say the Tosafot say this, but there were lots of Tosafists around Europe and in Tzfat. It was a movement. And what did the Tosafist movement really do in terms of halachic development? They read sources from one end of the Gemara to another, and they read codes that had already been starting to put together, from Maimonides to Sefer HaMitzvot to the Bahag to the big Sefer HaMitzvot to the small Sefer HaMitzvot. And they looked and they said, well, wait a minute. Can we apply this principle over here if we say that the fetus is part of the mother's body? And I know Halakhah says that Perek HaChovel in Bava Kama, I can't really injure anyone's body, or I have to really pay the fine or even pay the price if it's a real injury, like I wind up cutting off someone's limb and I have to understand what the penalty is. Aren't we saying that terminating a pregnancy is as bad as the criminal law would really call for when it comes to actually slicing someone's limb off? So this kind of Tosafot is not only on the pages of the Gemara, but there are collections of Halakhah from the Tosafists, and some of them are commentaries on the Gemara, and they come at the places that are relating, they come in commentaries that are relating to the places where these issues are discussed, and some of them are just chuvot. Some of them are collections of shoot, of responsum or responsa that exist, and some of them appear in major authorities who were trusted, like Trani, who we're reading right now, and we saw kind of how a Tosafist approach was on the mind of people, and that people were worried about it. And there might have had to been a time here and a case that we need to consider terminating a pregnancy. So it says, what do I do with this fact that the Tosafot are telling me that it's a crime to injure somebody, or I have the issue of injuring somebody, bodily harm? The Mishnah in chapter 7 of Oholot states, and it is only because the mother's life takes precedence that we can abort it. But were it not that there was a risk to her life, there is a matter of concern regarding taking the life of a fetus. So how then can we say in Arachin that we would kill the fetus directly with our hands because of concern of disfigurement of the mother? If I cause her bodily harm, I'm in trouble. And here's a little bit. And from the fact that the Gemara says it is obvious that we can abort the fetus of the woman who is condemned, it implies that as far as taking a fetal life is concerned, there is not the slightest issue of concern. Therefore, regarding a Jewish woman, in the case of a mother's need, it would appear that it is permissible to assist them to have an abortion, since it is for the sake of the mother's health. Now, this gets into a definitive state, making a definitive statement regarding the Mishnah Oholot being a foundational text when it comes to the matter of abortion and the matter of terminating pregnancies. It's also important that we hear the question and the concern, because it's the using of the framework of bodily injury that we are concerned about. And isn't that part of our concern when we think about the best ways to systematize for a society, for a family, the accessibility and the safety of the abortion that is possible? We find the right person to perform the abortion whom we trust the most, who takes care and has great concern for keeping the mother's health in focus as we take the quote-unquote pursuer out of her womb. While we have no concern about permitting that abortion, the question itself indicates the kind of worry and the kind of potential systems response we need to make when it comes to having abortions possible and available within our communities. In the 18th century, 1700s, Chavat Yair is going to address an issue that could come up very well within the regular throes of life and times that we all know, relationships, and how they create pressures on men and women, and how people turn to sometimes adulterous relationships in place of their married spouses, or for whatever reason you want to say adultery exists in the world. It happens this way, that people come and they experience all that it entails, and unfortunate times occur when people, when they thought it was just innocent or tried to get away with it, become pregnant and become very deeply regretful about it. You see that the Chovot Yair, Rabbi Yair Chaim ben Moses Samson Bachrach in Germany, 1638 to 1702, is dealing with a question regarding a question of a married woman who became pregnant through adultery. And the question is whether she is permitted to swallow some medicine that will cause her to abort. And you wanted to know my opinion regarding the matter. And it seems that your question is whether in general there is a sin of destroying a life in this case. Now, it would be possible to make a number of distinctions. And now he's going to get into a technical matter of the fetus, such as whether 40 days have passed. For before this time, it was mere water. Remember last class, we studied that Gemara. As it is stated in Yevamot and Kriyot, or whether 3 months have passed, which is the time when the pregnancy is visible, or if she sensed in her womb the movement of the infant, which occurs a brief time after the 3 months. We mentioned last time how interesting it was that they already were into trying to think about the periods of pregnancy, the time periods of pregnancy, and the experiences of it, and how it might play into the decision-making regarding terminations of pregnancies and abortion. Nevertheless, it is not our interest to decide based on how we would be inclined to think or the logic of the gut, but only according to Torah law. And so, the Mishnah in Nida states that only one who murders a one-day-old child is liable for execution. That's what we learned tonight at the outset on the source sheet. But not a fetus. You aren't considered to have committed a capital crime if you take the life of a fetus. And we said, as with last time, the life of a fetus. We understand that it's life, but we understand that there are decisions to make. And some of those decisions may be impacted, not just by the danger to the mother, but in this case, the she'elah, the halachic question, regards a child to be born of an adulterer. What do we say about that child, and what is to unfold for this woman and for this potential life? Nevertheless, before the fetus has detached, it would seem that it's permitted to abort it according to everyone, based on the Talmud in Arachim, where a condemned woman can be hit so that the fetus's death will not lead to her disgrace. This is a source we didn't look at, and it's a little bit of a different approach to this whole question of a condemned woman who's facing penalty. And you cannot ask from the fact that we violate Shabbat to save the life of a fetus, for perhaps that is really because of the life of the mother, for any danger to the fetus is a danger to the mother. And you cannot say that if it is permitted, why did the Gemara imply that were it not for the principle of it being part of her body, which is condemned to death, we would wait for the child to be born? How much more so not to cause its death? For it certainly is forbidden ab initio. He says we have a notion that there is sacredness to life. For It is no better than a case of masturbation, which is considered to be a slaughtering of children. And this gets into a different issue. He brings in the issue of seed, wasted seed. And masturbation is considered a grave offense. And the reason is because every drop of semen has a potential to create holy progeny. He wants to get to a place within halachic thinking that says, aren't we supposed to be thinking about this potential child as holy within the context of the Jewish people, despite the circumstances, despite the adultery? And one cannot say that the prohibition of masturbation is because of autoeroticism. Thus, even women are prohibited from wasting seed and destroying potential life. There was a matter of them thinking through in several other halachic sources that aborting the fetus is also wasting seed, the seed having been planted in the woman, and the man whose seed is in the woman will be wasted, and thusly it's a forbidden sin to waste his seed and abort the child. Therefore, based on what we've written, it would be completely permissible in your case, according to Torah law, were it not for the widespread practice among us and amongst them not to abort, because of a safeguard against fornicators and those who fornicate after them. So here he's turning, and even though he went through all the halachic issues and wants to figure out whether or not any one of them could apply and we should apply them, he's also saying that there's a societal reason that we do not allow abortion, and that is it will safeguard against, it will reduce fornicators and those who fornicate after them, meaning licentiousness within society will go crazy if you allow abortion to be used as birth control and adultery control. Nonetheless, in Chulin 33, Tosafot wrote as a matter of obvious fact that while one is exempt who aborts, nevertheless it is not permissible to do so. This is implicit in the Gemara's discussion that it had not been for the reason that the fetus is in her body and can be executed with her. There would be a logic to wait to save the fetus, and how much more so should we not cause its death at the outset? The reason for this is that to do so is no better than those who inflame themselves under every leafy tree and slaughter or squeeze out children. And the rabbis spoke in extreme terms regarding the prohibition to waste semen, and the reason is because it is possible that a holy life will be created from every drop. You see, he's going here towards the direction of the spirit of the Tosafot, which says, don't you want to say, ab initio, we don't abort? There is life involved, even if you're not defining this fetus as a life. Shouldn't we make sure that there isn't the use of abortion to be a birth control method and a response to adulterers within society? And don't we say that it's a waste of good seed for the Jews anyhow? Can't we make that kind of approach? Nevertheless, just because we can make an argument does not mean that we can make a ruling that it should be allowed for a woman. He says, I might have a source that says a woman's life, and you might be thinking about her life as an adulterer and what her life's going to be like afterwards, that she and her life could take precedence. This is like the precipice of thinking about her situation. We might be able to find a source to lean on. Although we have made arguments to actually act on it, we cannot permit it. And no more needs to be said about this. Now, please, my brother, do not burden me anymore with questions such as these, for it is only with difficulty that I answered you this time. Now, is that a way to end? It's not a feel-good way to end. But it's a way to end that says I can't permit it simply because I have a source that allows me to permit it every time. Regarding this type of approach for adultery and for licentiousness, this is one of the tropes in the 18th century that would come into halachic literature. There seemed to be some debate in general society about termination of pregnancies and Jewish halachic literature regarding termination of pregnancies that was addressing the issue of whether or not, since it was becoming that experts knew how to do this a little bit better, we had better equipment, we weren't all the way sterile, their sterilization was a thing to come in the future, right? But we were a little bit more able to find people who would perform these. Adultery, you could talk about the history of adultery as a whole series of lectures. This is a time when there's also real discussion. This happens to be one of those sins that we know is biblical to the very moment of the 18th century, but it's also something that seems to be coming up in halachic issues. More traveling is happening, and since more traveling is happening, perhaps you have more encounters, and availability of women in some ways is really changing vis-a-vis their making themselves available and participating in society as well. So I don't know if that's the cause per se, but this is a whole issue to think about, the social history and where adultery comes into play. But this particular approach in Germany, mind you, 500 years later, 600 years later, of a Jewish community that probably found itself permitting some abortions over time, here is this halachic source that said no. However, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the story regarding adultery, because another approach really comes forward within the German lands, and that is a few years after the Chavot Yair, Rabbi Chaim ben Moshe Samson Backrack, who we just looked at, and that soul is Rabbi Jacob ben Tzvi Emden, and Rabbi Emden will relate to the case of adultery in a very distinct and different way, also taking into account the Germanic lands ethos that Rabbi Yair Chaim ben Moses Samson Backrack had established, let's say 50, 60 years before that, in the tshuva we just read. So imagine that you are an 18th century Jew, and you know that one of the greatest decisors of that time is Rabbi Backrack. And Rabbi Backrack said, no, we can't just allow this, even though we have a permissive source. And we have lots of other halachic ways to think about it that we hadn't even talked about before, with the spilling of seed, and this is a terrible way for society to go. But Rabbi Emden is now going to rethink that, and he's going to do it in his nuanced and halachic way, with language that we are familiar with from all the sources we've studied and from Rabbi Backrack himself. And we're going to see how it goes a different direction. So let's look now. Rabbi Jacob Emden. Here's the essence of it, as not to bring you through a whole responsum that he wrote. The questioner asks about an adulterous married woman who is pregnant. It's a good question. He doesn't start off, why are you bothering me, brother? It appears to me to permit her to abort. And even in the case of a legitimate fetus, there is reason to be lenient if there is a great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge. So you're talking about what? Not just 30 days, not just 40 days, not 3 months, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge. Even if the mother's life is not in jeopardy, but only so as to save her from an evil associated with it that would cause her great pain. We have our language of how a woman asserts her feelings, her thinking, describes and explains her situation in Shelat Yavetz, in Rabbi Jacob Emden's definitive tshuva about the abortion issue. If she feels an evil is associated with it, if she's able to describe that psychological situation, and I'll go so far as to say psychological even before the term was in use at the time. What he meant by evil was not some existential good versus evil theological statement, but the situational evil of her experience of life. Then he said it would be legitimate to abort that fetus. In 1740, Rabbi Yehuda Ibn Ayash of Algiers, who I wanted to include because I wanted to include some sources other than the standard fare of the ribeye and the potatoes from Ashkenaz. So Rabbi Yehuda Ibn Ayash of Algiers, Shelo Teshuvot Beit Yehuda, Even HaEzer. I was asked and searched my heart, my intellect, to examine and explore what I had heard about a small group of women who become pregnant and do not want to give birth again. Okay, so I don't know if it's an organized group. I don't know if it's a community of women, or in a community, women are saying there's only a certain number of children. This is kind of one of those questions of social history. Is this an indication within halachic literature of people doing some family planning? Is this the first indication we have of it, among the first indications? There's not so many who explore this notion of women who don't want to give birth again. So this is what we would consider, at least I would consider so far in terms of what I've read, an early text about family planning. So they don't want to become pregnant again, and who do not want to remain pregnant anymore once they've already conceived. So maybe they were doing some basic but not so impactful or effective use of a wad of cotton or linen with certain ointments that they created and placed within, and really were trying to do some not only family planning, but early on contraception that they came up with, because we have some of those notes as well within literature. And some of these women, if they become pregnant while nursing another child, and they suspect the ayin hara, the evil eye, or danger of the new birth to the living child, and they make a medication and drugs that are known to them to terminate a child, and he will become a nefel. We've not talked about that term yet, but what is a miscarriage, a nefela, right? A nefel, one that falls. A non-viable fetus in this case, a nefel. Here, in the case of the women of this tshuva, there's suspicion about the pregnancy, and its potential for harm is acknowledged, and women are therefore permitted to ingest this medication. Behold, we have before us exactly what everyone acknowledges is an acceptable situation where an abortion would be permitted. To illustrate the danger to the living child and the mother, it's permitted to drink an abortive drug. So it seems, according to my understanding of the issue. Now, this is an expansion within this century. If you could mute, I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if a few people are not on mute, but I would appreciate if you would. This expansion is not only towards the life of the mother, but what did we just see? The life of the other child is taken into account. Because you could read very closely and say about our Mishnah, that's the foundational approach, that when the life of the mother is in danger, we actually allow for a termination. But now what we've seen is that this sage's understanding in Algiers is that when a child's life is endangered by another pregnancy, and I'm imagining he means both physically and by way of the children's situation within the family, he's allowing and permitting that abortion, that we have a source that allows us to consider that. Now, before I tell you about next week's fair, because that's my presentation for the night, I'll promise one more source that I'll read to you from modernity in terms of a good summary of kind of where we are. But before I do that, let's take some reflections and some comments and some questions so that we now explore these texts together that I've just presented thus far. Dale.
You haven't brought anything that relates to rape or incest. Are you aware of any such sources, since that's such a big part of our conversation today?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not today part of the conversation in terms of the sources that I put on the table, because I wanted to show you about building the ethic in terms of even cases that were not rape or incest. I will deal a little bit with rape and incest sources next week in order to show how that did capture some attention within the decisors' realm, except that it seems like, just to answer the question pretty squarely, it was never an issue with us that if either rape or incest happened, that they were as permissive, if not more, then they were as permissive, if not more, than the current sages that we looked at in the 18th century and the 19th century. All right?
In no place does anybody care about the man's responsibility in all of this. All these men are discussing, what should happen. The world hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. Sue was asking, what was the discussion of the man's place in all this? I happened to mention in passing the notion of the man's seed, and they were worried, the Tosafot, that he might be spilling seed and thus sinning, and we had to protect him. He was paid the fine because, in a certain sense, to be very straightforward about it, the fetus is the man's property of sorts. If a fine was to be levied, then it's looked at as property. But this is a very narrow read. And again, it's very easy to read narrowly and kind of be put off by the narrow read. Well, you're talking about a fine and the property of a man. The idea of even bringing the case forward equally and oppositely is to say, let's start a conversation about what just happened to this woman who was standing right there. Let's talk about the kind of decision that needs to be made with deference to the law and who's really responsible. Let's say that you yourself tried to perform that. Is this permission for the man to actually go through with what they in the ancient world didn't have abortion centers to try? Mm-hmm. Or for him to go out and hire the right person, because it would be up to him to hire? This was kind of the man is, if the code is written for men, as we like to say within the feminist read of things, then the man is being encouraged in a certain way to not worry that this is capital crime and get out there and go find someone who can help your wife. So if you read it that way, against the grain of sorts, towards everybody who participates in this, and everybody's reading this source, and the source is even for a man to understand, because he's so worried that he's going to be in trouble, then it gets him motivated to get out there and take care of this business. Diane or Aaron?
So two things that interest me in this last passage that we were talking about. One is that there's always been a thinking that a nursing mother couldn't get pregnant. And we know that that's not true. And they knew that in this last source. And the other was that there were potions that they knew could induce an abortion, which is just very interesting to me that, you know, it was the pill or Plan B long before it was marketed.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. There's some incredible scholarship about what I think scholars call postcoital contraception, and some of the discussion, actually Dale's question about rape, some of that discussion is about just what you can take, and some of the recipes for those appear early on in those tshuvot. Like I said, we didn't get to the late 19th century, and next week I'll bring it, but there is a Eastern European tshuva, obviously in anti-Semitic lands and just lands that we had to worry about being attacked, that really described how to take care postcoitally of this issue, and not just with a knife and to cut out, but to create one of these kinds of, what did you call them?
Plan B.
Plan Bs. There's also scholarship that says some of them were very poisonous, and we worried very deeply about giving them to women in our lives, the women of our communities. And those were very deep debates. And that's one of the reasons why early on, the questions of using them for rape and incest were so difficult, because I think there was some avoiding answering the questions, which sometimes happens within the great library of Jewish law. I mean, think about this, like when it speaks from silence, you have to ask why. And I think one of the issues is because it was just so dangerous. And so what did you do? You a lot of times you see texts where people adopt those children and they try to remake their status from mamzers, illegitimate children, to other types of children, even on that level. That's a unique approach that we don't have time to go through sources about, but the very, very interesting approach. Others? Yeah, I know I said I wasn't going to do the sources this week, Dale.
So
they had less of an issue with the cases for which they had less of an issue with abortions for which they had experts around in certain societies. I think that's the equal and opposite of what I was saying before about the worry about the poison and the worry about giving people potentials kinds of abortifacients that would try to induce the abortion. And there were actual medical manuscripts that were written and authored and compiled so that communities would have them in order to approach these situations and to create remedies. And so that's just to put in the back of our minds as well next time. All right, if there's not further questions, or Charlie, do you have a comment or a question?
I was actually going to ask you about frozen embryos, but that may be outside your
outside my expertise. Yeah. So I'm not gonna go to the frozen embryo direction. Let me share with you that in our age, there's some really great work done to summarize where we are with regard to abortion at the beginning or in the early part of the 20th century. And we go back and we see that the idea that there's a prohibition against any of this, when there is the opinion that there is a rabbinic prohibition against it, based on a read to the right of Maimonides, who says, if it's a rodef, then I have to see this in some way as murder. And if I want to go that direction and I go a little bit to the right of Maimonides, we didn't go that direction, but there is some look at it like that. We went that direction with the Tosafot, who might say, whoa, whoa. And we went that direction with the early Germanic source that said no about the abortion regarding adultery. The prohibition is a weak one. We saw last week that Kabbalistically, the Zohar was really worried that there would be disregard for the sacredness of life and God's handiwork. That makes it to the list of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, who still is going to be quite permissive about abortions and build a Jewish case for why the prohibition is weak when it was a prohibition, if somebody says it's a prohibition. But he really wants to remind you of that source that we looked at last week, which was a Zoharic source that said, you're really insulting God's handiwork if you go forward and go through with an abortion. He says, though, even when there is no danger, but the mother's health is a concern. It's very delicate. And for the sake of her health, or to relieve her of severe pain, it is advised to perform an abortion, even though there is no real risk of life. Even here, one can allow it, according to the judgment of many poskim. Now, he'll insist that a posek has to be consulted by including the phrase, according to the judgment of many poskim. And in fact, to weigh this out very much so with a trusted source and someone who can be trusted to really understand the situation of a particular woman and family, this is really what he's giving you the list for and writing the way he does. And he also says, as Diane just mentioned, one can also allow as above when the woman is nursing, because he understood already that you can get pregnant then, and that the milk could be impacted or the child affected. Here, he says, I was going to wait till the next time, but again, since it came up in questions, a married woman who committed adultery or was raped and became pregnant, even from a non-Jew, where the child would not be a mamzer, and she is now repented in the case of adultery, adds that into the mix. There's some repentance to do. A number of great decisors are inclined to allow for an abortion, either because of her shame or because of desecration of the divine name that would be attached to the family, the child, and the mother, and the shame and stigma to the family that would persist. So we have some deep thinking about not only the woman's physical health, but of the situation that a family, a child, and a particular mother may experience. And this provides for us with the notion of Jewish law in the making as individuals come with their questions to poskim. This provides for an approach that I may take if someone comes and wants advice about whether or not it would be permissible to terminate a pregnancy. done in the great rubric of sacred is life itself and God's handiwork is a miracle. We have further sources within especially this 17th century, 18th century, and into the 19th century, this early 20th century source to further the discussion when it comes to more, let's now say, scientifically new situations that have come up over time and might fit into the abortion or termination of pregnancy categories were we to decide to stop a fetus from growing once it's begun. That will be some of what we deal with next time. I will also be looking at many different Jewish responses from within the same movements, again, because you could say that all of these poskim, by the way, we've looked at are quote unquote Orthodox, even though that term is not flying around and we have to be careful with how we use it in terms of history. But these are all from the same world of traditional Judaism who give us this dynamic, different kind of approaches, these dynamic, different kind of approaches to the issue. But you can see they're kind of crystallizing into one approach, but that will expand again within our time. And I'll be looking at some of the latest literature coming out of America and Israel and different either movements or rabbinic groups and associations to finish up the law seminar next week. Thanks for coming. Great to learn with you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you,
wonderful.
Rabbi.
So much.
Thank you.